I am going to be talking about this interesting moment in history that we find ourselves in, and talk about what happens and what we can expect to see as the world starts to get more and more autonomy within its systems. And I'm going to structure my talk in this way. I'm going to uh, ask historically how we've thought about the autonomous world and what we've learned from those ideas, and understand what we've seen. Then investigate what this moment about large language models and these chatbots that have rushed onto the stage means, and the extent to which these technologies will accelerate any trends towards autonomy or change the direction of them. Um, I'll dive into how I use them a little bit myself, and ultimately talk about where they're going and what that means for the governance and development of this autonomous world, and ultimately what it means for all of us. This is the Gosplan building, which for 70 years was the centralized top-down state planning apparatus of the Soviet Union, determining how many tractors to build and how many bed sheets to make and how many left shoes to make and how many right shoes to make. And it, it didn't do very well, but one of the critics of that model was the economist Friedrich Hayek. And what he argued was that distributed actors and agents working through very simple signals in Hayek's model, the price signal across the economy, become very efficient allocators of resources compared to centralized decision makers. Uh, the local knowledge they bring, their ability to signal to each other about scarcity and demand would allow for that spontaneous order and the production of things that we expected. So the idea of an autonomous world is one that is rooted both in historical theory, but also in practice. And many sectors of the world have gone autonomous, are showing elements of being autonomous already. Uh, the financial services industry is a really great example of that. There are typically two ways that one can invest in assets. You can invest in an active way. We can think about someone who's overpaid and seemingly clever, who chooses stocks and shares that you should invest in. That's someone who's called an active manager. But there's also an autonomous way of investing, which is through passive vehicles. These are vehicles that just track the collective intelligence of the market and buy broad indices. What's interesting is that last year, the amount of assets held in passive, these sort of autonomous vehicles, exceeded the amount held in active vehicles. And we also know from the data that uh, passive investment vehicles on average outperform the active ones. There's some sort of intelligence embedded in that autonomy. And the financial services industry has other aspects of autonomy that have started to emerge over the past 25 years. One of the big ones has been the idea of algorithmic trading. We may have seen films like Trading Places, where financial instruments traders are standing in pits, screaming at each other and throwing bits of paper. That world is long gone, but so too have been diminished has been the number of humans who sit behind the machines and decide exactly when to buy a stock. Over the last 25 years, more and more shares are traded by algorithms responding to overall strategies set by people. And there's a lot to learn from that, because now about 70% of all trades are done autonomously. And if we look at the internet itself, there's something fascinating about the pattern of traffic on the internet. Bots are slowly taking it over. So if we think about humans and sort of humans as directed entities with agencies deciding what to look at and what to consume, well, we make up roughly half of all the internet traffic, despite all of our TikToking and Netflixing that exists. The other half is created, generated by bots, the bad bots outnumbering the good nearly 2 to 1. And what's quite interesting, I think, about looking at those two examples of the financial services, the financial markets, and the internet is that it shows that we're sort of somewhat familiar with a world that has this move towards autonomy for both the good and the bad. It's really worth understanding what we've learned about these tools in the couple of years since they've been more widely available. They're proving themselves to be cognitive productivity pills. And a number of surveys and studies, rather than surveys, from MIT and Harvard Business School and Stanford have shown that when you give knowledge workers of different types access to these large language models, they see improvements in the amount of time they take. They see improvements in the quality of their work. And in a really fascinating um, conclusion, studies increasingly show that they're skill equalizing. So they help us more at things that we're bad at this stage than things that we're necessarily excellent at. And the really great study that I particularly like is the Harvard Business School BCG one, which showed that when you gave a highly trained management consultant a large language model, the bottom half of performers improved by 43%, but the top half improved by roughly 17%. We're also starting to learn that these tools can be a mirror or into us around empathy and creativity, or perhaps not a mirror so much, but a telescope or a magnifier. And studies show increasingly that, and I've just chosen two here, that LLMs can undertake small creative thinking, divergent thinking tasks better than average and sometimes even good humans. A chart on the left, GPT-4, which is the best one we have at the moment, outperforming there in the green, a group of humans being tested on creativity. But also perceived empathy in terms of how empathetic their responses are relative to human responses. And again, that's a chart on the right with humans in the pink and GPT-4 in two shades of green, essentially being rated as being more empathetic than humans. And those two things are quite powerful, because when we think about a lot of work that any of us do, some of it is very, mechanistic and convergent and just needs to get done. But a lot of it, especially the highly valued work, involves more divergent thinking. And it certainly involves communication and empathy. In the last 18 months, I have really found myself moving over to using large language models more and more frequently. I looked at my information behavior over the course of 1 week earlier this year, and I found that I was doing about 400 Google queries a week, of which about 270 were really trivial, like the phone number of my barber, and a small number were much, much harder. But the large language models were actually being used by me for those hard style of tasks far more than I used Google search. And those sessions tended to be much, much longer than search, with many, many follow-on questions. And one of the things I observed was that when I was working with the large language models for research, they would be prompting me for further avenues that I might take my questions. And in a sense, autonomously pushing out a suggestion that I go off and explore in a particular direction. So I've had really interesting experiences using these tools, and to the extent that I now build workflows that the machines go off and execute on their own. Very, very simple ones, to be fair, but that take advantage of those skill sets that I talked about earlier on. So what's coming down the pipe is pretty important for this story. So the first is that the cost of using large language models is collapsing. The top chart here. It is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And just a couple of months ago, OpenAI released something called GPT-4 O, O for Omni, and it halved its prices still further. And at the same time, the models are getting progressively more capable. Of course, GPT-4 is still the high watermark, but we know that there are better things that are coming along in the pipeline. And so what does that mean? What it means is that our ability to use large language models as agents, and what do I mean by an agent? I mean to give it a task and let it undertake that task and pass the results of that task to another workflow automatically, and that other workflow might be another large language model, increases. Uh, It'll become more affordable because the prices are coming down, and because they're becoming more capable, these things will become more robust. So we should see a vast increase in the amount of tokens that we use. We should see many more models being put in place. And what I've discovered over my time using these technologies is that even today you can put together quite simple workflows, where effectively it's a little bit like delegating a task to a small group of people. And to give you a really particular example, I have a workflow that I've built that's called Consensus. I use a tool called Wordware to run this. And what I can do with Consensus is I can put in a research question. Maybe I'm asking something about battery development for renewable storage. And Consensus will take that question and it will pass it through to 4 different large language models, each of which will act as a researcher. And then a 5th model will take the output from each of those 4 models and it will evaluate them according to criteria I've set for it. And once it's done that, it will summarize the best arguments from those 4 research agents and present me a single output. Now, it's a really, really basic workflow, but it shows that we have a technology that is probably just good enough to start to be used in these types of contexts.